In this two-part tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make this super cool ebony and silver ring with a pearl inlay. So for the first part, I'll basically be showing you how to make your own silver ring core. This will be with silver wire and silver sheet, so no casting or anything too complicated. And then in the second part of the tutorial, I'll just be kind of refreshing over, putting in a wood inlay into a metal ring core, and then how to set a pearl dot. So yeah, lots of cool, interesting techniques for this one. So I hope that you enjoy it. This will be part one, which is all about making the silver ring core. So to make the sterling silver core of this ring, I used a piece of 0.8mm thick sterling silver sheet and some 1.5mm square silver wire. I got both of these from cooksandgold.com. I also used two different types of solder. So I used easy solder for the outer collars, and then hard solder for all of the other joints, like the seams of the rings. All will be explained shortly, but the first job really was to create like a simple silver band for like the inner sleeve. So you've seen me do this before, really. It's all pretty simple stuff. I got the 0.8mm silver sheet pre-prepared and shaped into like a D shape. Applied a bit of hard solder and with some flux, and then heated the ring evenly until the solder melted into the join. And then after a quick pickling, I was able to hammer out the silver ring until I could fit it onto a metal ring mandrel, where I hammered it more until it came out ring shaped. Then after a good hammering and bringing it to a nice round shape, I put it onto a ring stretcher to get it up to the correct size. So basically the first part of making this a ring with collars was actually to make the inner sleeve. Like I said here, there's nothing new in this part of the tutorial. You've seen me do all this before previously, so you can go back and, you know, if you want a full explanation of what's going on in all of these little clips, then you can skip back and watch the previous video. But before kind of soldering on the collars, I just got the ring up to the correct size and, you know, cleaned it all up, got all of the excess solder off, and kind of made it semi-presentable before soldering on the collars. So to make the collars, I first needed to figure out roughly how much silver wire I would need to cut. So I measured the outer diameter of the ring that I just made, and this would be then the inner diameter of the collars. And then using the equation of inner diameter plus the thickness of the material multiplied by pi, I came up with 18.2 millimeters plus 1.5 millimeters multiplied by pi. And I couldn't figure that out off the top of my head, so I had to do it on my calculator on my phone. So 19.7 times 3.143 equals 61.91 mil. So I just rounded that down to like 61.9. I was then able to measure out, using the calipers, the correct lengths of wire. But before I did that, I just sort of used a couple of files to make the end of the wire square. Then I measured out made a little mark with a pencil and used my jeweler's saw to cut down a couple of pieces that were about 61.9 mil long. So essentially, to make a silver ring with collars, you actually make 3 separate rings and then solder them all together. So I used the 2 pieces of wire I just cut to make 2 small rings. So similar kind of technique is what I use to make any silver ring. I just formed them into, you know, like a rough D shape, so that both edges or both ends of the ring kind of meet up to form a seam in the middle, and then manipulated those with the pliers just to kind of make sure that the seams met up and there was, you know, a nice tight fit. And then I was able to apply some flux and some hard solder to those seams and just solder them up as usual with a soldering torch. I used hard solder on these 2 seams and the first seam on the initial kind of inner sleeve ring because hard solder melts at a higher temperature. So when it came to kind of soldering the 2 smaller rings to the inner sleeve ring, it meant that these initial joints, you know, the solder wouldn't melt out of them, if that makes sense. So you always use the hard solder on the first seams, and then if you need to solder again, you use an easy solder so that your solder doesn't melt. Hope that makes sense. After soldering the 2 smaller rings, I dunked them in pickle and left them until they were clean, which took like 10 minutes. And then I was left with these horrible D shapes, which the same as the usual technique really. Just hammered them out using a rawhide hammer and a metal mandrel, just to hammer them out until they were ring shaped. And then after hammering, they were kind of all wonky and a bit of a weird shape. So what I like to do is put them onto a flat surface, which in this case I just used like the metal part of my bench peg, and then use the rawhide hammer to hammer them until they're flat. So the rings needed to be completely flat before I could kind of go ahead and solder them to the inner sleeve or inner core, whatever you want to call it. After a good bit of hammering, both the rings were flat, and then I used some emery paper just to kind of clean off any excess solder and get the 2 smaller rings ready to solder to the inner big ring. In an ideal world, if you're making a silver ring like this with collars, and you want the collars to be as tight a fit as possible onto the inner sleeve. So before kind of test fitting them, I used a number 2 file, a half round file, just to kind of clean up the inner edges of those collars, and then did a quick test fit. So you'll see there that the first one was a pretty good tight fit. Took a bit of a struggle to get it on, but that's perfect. Then the other one was just slightly too small to go on. So if this is the case, there's a few things you can do. You can either file out the inside of the collar, which I did, still didn't fit, or you can file the outer edge of the the larger kind of inner sleeve ring. So in this case, I just carried on with filing and testing until I had a fairly decent fit. And it was quite a tight squeeze to get it on. But another option is you can just use a ring stretcher and just kind of stretch that collar up just a slight bit, but you have to be careful with this because it's really easy to go too far. But anywho, in the end, I got both of those collars to fit over the sleeve really nice and tightly. And then just to seal the deal, I put the hool ring onto the ring stretcher and stretched out the inside while the collars were still attached. But just kind of tightened everything up and just made sure that it was, you know, a really tight mechanical fit before I'd even done any soldering. With a super tight mechanical fit achieved, I moved on to soldering the collars to the sleeve, and for this I used easy silver solder. So I cut off probably about 12 to 14 pieces of the easy solder, and then I just used a bit of scrap like bezel wire just to elevate the ring off the soldering block, as it just helps the ring to conduct heat a bit better. It's not essential though, it's just a preference of mine. What I did next was apply flux to the one of the outer edges, and then use a little paintbrush to put all my pieces of solder onto the outside edge. I'd say pretty much more is better really at this stage. I probably should have used a few more pounds of solder than this, but it worked. So I put a bit extra more flux on over the top of those little pallions, and then I moved on to soldering. So for this, sometimes I use 2 torches, but it was only a small ring, so that wasn't really necessary. So I just kind of, same as usual really, heated the whole ring evenly, and then gradually kind of focused the flame over those palings of solder until they melted down. And you can see when the solder runs, it kind of flows into the seam between the collar and the inner core. Very satisfying. After a good quenching, I repeated the same on the other side, and then all of my ring was soldered together. With all the soldering done, the ring really needed a good bath in the pickle. So the pickle solution, I made that up and then left her in there for a good like 10, 15, I think it was actually 20 minutes, just to kind of clean off all the oxidization and leftover flux. And I was left with this beautiful silver channel ring. I guess that's what we can call it. A silver channel ring, or a silver ring with collars. Now, at this stage, you can either just go ahead and use files and emery paper to kind of clean off the excess solder and make the ring, presentable, ready for finishing. Or in my case, I actually needed the ring to have like a slightly wider inlay channel. So it's really my bad because I should have really started with a wider band and then soldered the collars on. But in this case, I kind of messed up. So I needed to make the inlay channel wider. So I just cheated and I used my metal lathe, where I just mounted the ring onto an expanding mandrel and then used like a parting off tool just to kind of take a few millimeters off of the inner edges of the collars. Like I said, that's not essential, If you don't have a metal lathe, don't worry. You can make this all with just your silversmithing tools, and you don't really need a metal lathe. But that's it. That's how I made a sterling silver ring core with collars, or you can call it a sterling silver channel ring. They've got lots of different names, but this ring was now ready to inlay. So in the next part of the tutorial, I'm going to show you how I put wood in there, and this one actually had a pearl dot inlay as well. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you learned a lot. Feel free to hit me up with any questions. In part 2 of this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I took this sterling silver channel ring and then inlay it with some wood and a cool pearl inlay. So to start off, I took a digital caliper and measured the width of the inlay channel, which was just shy of 4 millimeters. And I'd already had a piece of ebony that I'd pre-prepared with my usual bentwood method. So I basically took a metal ruler and a craft knife, cut off a 4mm slice of the ebony, and then sanded down one edge until it was paper thin. And then I just did a test wrap to make sure that it would fit into the silver channel ring, which it did nicely. And I actually wrapped the piece of ebony in so it formed 2 layers of wood in the ring. I then cut off the excess from the strip of wood and sanded down the other edge that I just cut until that was also paper thin. And then I was able to crack on with my glue up. So again, I just sort of test wrapped the wood into the channel, the inlay channel. And that was a really, really good fit, first time. Skills. I also thought it would be a good idea at this stage to check that the little pearl dots that I had for the inlay would fit in that channel as well. And I thought I'd check it out just in case I needed to, make the channel wider, as I wouldn't be able to do that after I'd sort of put the woodland inlay in. So yeah, I got these 2 little mother of pearl inlay dots. They're used a lot in guitar making or lutherie. And so yeah, they were sort of just shy of 4mm wide as well, and so they did fit nice and tight into the inlay channel. Pretty cool. So when I knew that everything was a good fit, I used some medium thickness CA glue and tweezers to glue the wood into the inlay channel. So you can see the technique I used there. I've described this in other videos on the course as well, where I just applied a bit of CA glue with a cocktail stick and then used the tweezers to kind of press it down, or use my hands to kind of wrap it in. So I just went around and wrapped the wood into the inlay channel. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. The next thing to do was to make a hole in the wood that would accommodate that pearl dot. So to do that, I used some of these little bears in a rotary tool. I actually used my Fordham flex shaft, but you can do this with just like a flex shaft from a Dremel. And the bear's a little bit smaller than the width of the pearl dot, which is pretty much a good thing, I think, at this stage, as I was able to just gradually carve the hole until it would accommodate the pearl dot. So this is a precarious little technique. It's not for the faint-hearted, but I just kind of held the ring in place in the jaws of a drill press vise with some rubber jaws, and then I just used the burr to carve out a hole, and I just continuously test to see if that pearl dot would fit. So you can see there that in my first attempt it was nowhere near. So I just carried on with the burr and just kind of gradually made that hole a little bit bigger. There was no kind of hard or fast way to do this. I literally just did it all by eye. At one stage I was carving away when I noticed that the one of the layers of the wood kind of delaminated. So all I did was I just took a little bit of CA glue and kind of popped that, well, just put that under where the wood had delaminated. Then I was able to just stick that back down and carry on as normal. So this is where cocktail sticks come in really handy. And the flat part of the tweezers is really useful for kind of pressing the wood down as well. So yeah, I just carried on with the rotary tool and the burrs and just gradually made that hole a little bit wider and a little bit wider, sort of fraction of a millimeter at a time, until I got the pearl dot to fit. Ta-da! So to actually glue the dot in, I just used, again, medium thickness CA glue. It's probably a good idea to use a 2-part epoxy resin, but I just wanted to kind of get the inlay in there quickly. Now I did have sort of a little bit of a gap between the pearl and the wood, and when the CA glue was still wet, I just was able to use a bit of the ebony dust from where I'd sanded the wood earlier in the process and just kind of like press that into the gaps, and then, I mean, it did a really good job of disguising the fact that there was a little gap between the pearl and the wood, so that worked really well. So with the pearl glued in and the gaps filled as well, it was time to kind of clean up the inlay channel and get it ready for finishing. Now you'll see there that the actual pearl dot was like quite high. It wasn't flush with the surface of the wood. So all I did was I just took a couple of needle files and just went over and gently filed the pearl until it was flush with the surface of the wood. This took a little while, but again I just kept on, do a bit of filing and then test, and then do a bit of filing and test. So a paintbrush came in really handy there to brush away the dust. But when the pearl was sort of flush with the wood, I just mounted the hool ring onto a lathe. Again, I just used the expanding ring mandrel, but I mean you could use a wooden mandrel for this. And then I cut a few strips of sandpaper, nothing too drastic. I think I just used 320, 400, 600 and 1200 grit. And I cut the strips so they were about 3.5 mil wide. Then I was able to run the lathe and sand down the wood and the pearl together. And then after I'd used the wet and dry sandpaper strips, I just used a few grits of micro mesh. I think I worked up to the 12,000 grit, and then I was able to just use some surgical spirit or some rubbing alcohol and a paintbrush to wash away any dust and get the ring cleaned up ready for finishing. At this stage I was pretty excited to see what it would look like with a finish, because it just looked so damn nice. For a finish I used medium thickness CA glue, just applying very thin layers one at a time into the inlay channel, and I use an activator spray in between layers or coats just to help speed up the curing process of the glue and stop it from blooming or bubbling. And pretty much I just applied layers of glue until the inlay channel was slightly overfilled. So I lost count of how many layers it took. I think it took me about 8 or 9 layers applied like this with a cocktail stick. Eventually that inlay channel was slightly overfilled with CA glue, which would give me plenty of room to sand it back flush with the silver. So before polishing up the outside of the ring with the CA glue, I just used a sharp craft knife to scrape off any excess glue that had kind of seeped over onto the silver collars. So I took about maybe 5-10 minutes to do that. Very intense on the thumbs, but definitely worth doing. And then I just mounted the ring back on the expanding ring mandrel and used multiple grits of wet and dry sandpaper, 320, 400, 600, 1200 grits, just to bring the CA glue back flush with the silver and get a nice kind of pre-polish over that CA glue. So in between grits, I actually sanded one way with the lathe and then sanded kind of a crossways with each grit as well, just to make the finish on the CA a little bit nicer. So yeah, I just worked through those grits, just wet sanding, just to get a nice smooth finish on that CA. Then I used my micro mesh grits, so 240, 4000, 8000 and 12,000, and I just repeated the same similar kind of process just to get that CA glue nice and shiny. And then I finally used a burnishing cream from Chestnut Products to really bring out a gleaming finish over the CA glue. And then for polishing the inside and outer edges and inside edges of the silver, I mounted the ring into a finger saver McJiggy made out of a rubber crutch ferrule. And then I just went through the grits using emery paper. So I just used like 240, 500, 1200 and 2000 grit emery papers there over the silver. And then to polish the silver up, I used 2 polishing compounds on a rotary tool. First of all, I used the brown compound Tripoli, which is quite like an aggressive abrasive. So I just whipped over every silver portion of the ring with some Tripoli on a cotton buffing wheel on the rotary tool. And then after the Tripoli, I washed the ring off a little bit with some soapy water, and then popped the ring into an ultrasonic cleaner as well. And the reason behind doing that is to avoid contaminating the next polishing compound with the Tripoli. So after I'd cleaned it all off, I did exactly the same thing with the red polishing compound, which is known as Rouge. And that brought out a really beautiful finish on the silver. The CA glue had a beautiful finish to it as well. And just overall, I think that was a very well rendered ring. So this 2-part tutorials, you know, you've learned a lot here. How to create a silver ring core, kind of a refresher on how to inlay wood into a metal ring core, how to do a pearl inlay, polishing, CA glue, the whole shabonk. Anyway, I'm really happy with this one. I actually think that this is a truly next level wooden ring. I'd love to see you guys have a go at making one. So hit me up if you have any questions, and do send me pictures if you ever make anything like this. See you in the next one.